Hi, everybody. Welcome back. In the last video, we introduced the idea that we can discretize the conformational portion of the search involved in protein design and thus move from a mixed, discrete, continuous optimization problem into a fully discrete combinatorial optimization problem for a framing of protein design. And that the fact that amino acids have very strongly preferred conformations, a relatively small number of them in proteins of known structure, lets us define rotamer libraries that cover most of the observed structures with a relatively modest library size. We did see, however, that the combinatorics makes these problems ridiculously huge in the number of choices, but there may be some light in terms of methods to solve the problem in the realization that the underlying energy function is fundamentally pairwise, and we may be able to compute all pairs of interactions. In this video, we're going to move forward with that discussion, formalize a set of notation to describe the problem, and introduce one approach that can be and has been used to tackle the problem in this way. Okay, so let's begin by switching over to the board. All right. And let's start off by just sort of being clear on the notation that we're going to want to use, right? And being consistent on this and laying it out clearly at the beginning will help us hopefully deal with what can be a little bit of a messy problem for some of these algorithms. So remember that our goal is to choose one rotamer. And a rotamer is a amino acid plus its conformation. At each position. And this will give us a final sequence plus structure when we know that we're also given a backbone structure, which is the target structure in design. And of course, the specific rotamer we want to choose at each position is the one that in combination with all others will give us the best overall energy for that backbone structure. So let's first of all define I, which will range from 1 to n, be the set of positions, positions in the sequence. And this may map onto the linear sequence, or it may be in a different order, doesn't really matter. What matters is that we cover all of the possible positions. And then we're going to let S sub I, which can range from 1 to M sub I, be the set of, actually this isn't quite the set. Just to be clear on notation, the set of all positions, of course, is 1 to n. I is actually simply the position. S, the set of all rotamers would be I to Mi. Si is a rotamer choice at position I. And we note that we have allowed in this notation we have allowed the number of rotamers may depend on position. We'll see later that there are algorithmic reasons where actually the number of rotamers will change, allowed in the position will change dynamically through the algorithm. But even as a priori, the setup of the problem, it's often the case that we may wish to guide the algorithm with, or guide the design problem with certain constraints. For example, restricting core positions to be hydrophobic and surface positions to be hydrophilic, or something along those lines, or to fix one position that we know needs certain properties to be a constrained set of possibilities. And these mean that we may not be working with the same set of rotamers at every position. Although in other design problems, we will be looking at essentially a common set of rotamers at each position. But this notation allows us to cover both of them. Once we have that, then the set of SIs, that is the set of choices of rotamer at position I, for all I in 1 to n, what does this describe? This describes making one choice at every position. Describes a complete sequence and structure. Right? And thus our goal is to find out what those S sub i's are. Right? Now, we might write it in this way. We also may write this in a vector notation of some S defined as some vector S1, S2 to Sn as a shorthand for capturing this choice of all making a choice at all possibilities. With this, we are actually now ready to define an energy. How are we going to define the energy associated with a particular sequence? Well, the energy of sequence S can be broken down. Remember, we're working with this molecular mechanics force field. And we know how to write out an energy explicitly in terms of positions of atoms. We want to write out our energy in terms of these rotamers. How do we do this? Well, do this by breaking this up into 3 distinct pieces. The first is what I am going to refer to as E fixed. This is the portion of the energy that does not change in the design. It's a constant that depends on the target structure and any other fixed portions of the design problem. We then add to this a sum from I equals 1 to n of what I will refer to as self-energies. And this is a self-energy for rotamer I. We then add to this another sum, and we can, this is a sum over all pairs. We can either do this with a half and then dividing, not accounting for double counting, allowing us to double count, or we can avoid the double counting. And this is what I'm going to write down here. I equals 1 to n. J equals I plus 1 to n. This I starting the second sum at I plus 1 ensures that we don't double count. And then write in this double sum what we're going to call a pair energy. And this pair energy is going to depend on the rotamer choice that we've made at 2 different positions. Now, each of these terms is going to include different parts of the overall molecular mechanics energy, and they need to end up being equal. Let me start with defining this pair energy. The pair energy, we've discussed in the last video how, because of the nature of the molecular mechanics force field and how the bonded interactions, bond angles, dihedrals, can't never extend more than 3 bonds, but there are 5 bonds separating the side chains of 2 different amino acids. That means that the interactions between 2 side chains, and the rotamers are specifically the side chains, involves only non-bonded interactions. And so we might write this pair energy as a sum over X in the atoms of Si, and then a sum over Y in the atoms of Sj, and a Leonard-Jones interaction between X and Y, and a Coulombic interaction between X and Y, only the non-bonded piece. Sometimes we use more complicated energy functions that have additional terms, but this is the simplest form. Now, the self-energy, what is this going to include? Well, the self-energy is made up of a few pieces. Right? It involves all of the energetic terms that depend on the atoms of a particular side chain, but not on the atoms of any other side chain, right? So the pair energy includes all the interactions between 2 side chains. The self energy includes interactions between the side chain and other atoms in the side chain, as well as interactions between atoms in the side chain and things in the backbone. Right? So we might write this as there will indeed be bond angles, bond terms in this self energy. And so there will be some set of bonds that include an atom of Si, and we'll have a bond energy of each of those. We'll have a sum over all of the angle terms that include an atom in that side chain. We'll have a sum over dihedral angles that involve an atom of that side chain. And then we will have a sum over all of the atoms in Si. And then in here, so we need to take, this is a sum over all of the atoms in Si. And we need to include the non-bonded interactions of those atoms, both with other atoms in Si, as well as atoms in the fixed portion. And so we might write this as two, actually, I won't do the parentheses there. It might just be a little bit clearer if I separate them out. So we'll have a double sum over other atoms in Si. These are both Si. These two sum in the pair, it was a sum over Si and Sj. This is a sum over Si and Si with, of course, excluding the case where they're exactly the same, of a Leonard-Jones and Coulombic term for those, plus one more term, a sum over atoms in Si, and then a sum over atoms that are in the fixed portion. That is, they are not in another side chain. They're part of the backbone or other constraints. And again, this piece also has a Leonard-Jones and a Coulombic piece for these. And in these two terms, in the pair energies, we include all of the interactions between two side chains. In the self energies, we include all of the energies that one side chain makes that don't include other side chains, but do include the fixed piece. And then the fixed piece here that I'm not going to write down the energy function of also involves bond terms, angle terms, dihedral angles, and non-bonded interactions, but only those that involve exclusively atoms that are fixed, that aren't changing in the design. When we add up all of these, this covers all of the individual terms. Now, when we think about this, right? We think about how many of these things do we need to compute. The fixed energy is something that we just have to compute once per design, right? For a given target backbone, for a given problem, this is a constant. We might want to compute it, so we make sure that we know what the total energy is, but it's a constant in the optimization. And constants you can add or subtract from a maximization or a minimization problem without affecting the outcome. And so it actually has no impact on the optimization. So we may calculate it. We don't even have to. We could ignore the problem, ignore that piece entirely. The self energies we need to compute for each SI at all positions I. How many are these? This means that we need to do essentially the total number that we need to compute is a sum mi from I equals 1 to n, or n times m if mi are constant, if we have a fixed library that we're using at every position. Right? So in the shorthand notation, we'll say that the cost of this is order n times m in the number of positions that we need to, and size of the library. Then the pair energies, SI, SJ, we need to compute these for each pair, SI, SJ, at all pairs of positions. What this really sort of means is what we need to do in the most sort of rigorous definition. We need to do a sum over I from I equals 1 to n, a sum from I equals n, I plus 1 to n. This is over all pairs of positions, and we don't double count in this form. And then how many pairs of choices are there at each position? There's mi times mj possibilities at each of those positions. The when we have all rotamer, the same number of rotamer choices at every position, this becomes n over n minus 1, n times n minus 1 over 2, roughly n squared over 2, to account for the sum over all pairs of positions, times m squared to account for all pairs of choices. Right? And as we discussed in the last lecture, this piece here, which is order n squared m squared as kind of a rough estimate, is expensive but not infeasible. It's within the realm of possibility for our problems. This means that we are able to, within this kind of pairwise energy function, we are able to compute all of the individual pieces. And what are we trying to then do, given this whole framework? We are trying to find the minimum over all possible sets of rotamer vectors, if you will, vectors of rotamer choices at each position. This energy of that we defined on the previous screen here as a fixed plus a sum of self plus a double sum over pairs. And we can compute all of those individual terms up front so we know what they are, right? Okay, now in this optimization, as we sort of said, we can do this in kind of two different ways. We could write this using our full energy. And I'm going to leave out the indices here. Just for simplicity. This is a perfectly equivalent to writing E fixed plus min over all S, the sum of the self plus the double sum of the pair. And this is because the fixed piece is a constant, so we can take it out of the minimization. And it often makes sense because of this to focus down on this piece of the puzzle. This sum over all possible self energies and double sum over all possible pair energies. So it actually turns out that once again, we can frame this in the language of linear algebra, in the language of matrices. How do we do this? Well, we note here that before we just how to do it, why do we think we might be able to do this? Anytime you see double sums and things like this, you should think double sums matrix multiplication. This might be something that we're able to do. How do we do this? Well, I'm going to define a vector x that, actually before we do that, let's define our energy matrix first. And let's go on to a new screen to do this. Define an energy matrix. H equals. Now, what is this going to want to encode? This has to store, we want this energy matrix to store all of the information that we have. So I'm going to structure this as a block matrix where, where we start with I equals 1. Let me use a different color for those who can see color easily. It'll help a little bit, but it's not necessary. I equals 1 is going to be a block. I equals 2 is going to be another block. Then we'll continue there down to n, and we'll have a final block for n piece. And this is going to be a square matrix. So we can also have j equals 1, another block, j equals 2, another block, also going to n, a final block here. That structures the positions. Inside each block, we can then set another set of indices, and we can think about going S1 equals 1 to 2 up to M1, S2 equals 1, 2 up to M2, Sn equals 1, 2 up to Mn. And once again, we do the same thing for both the rows and for the columns. Right? And so this has all possible choices of rotamers at all possible positions in the rows and the columns. Now, what do we do inside here? Sorry, I lost my pen here. There we go. Inside each block, we're going to put in our energies, and it's going to depend a little bit on what energy we are interested in working with. For the cases where I equals J are the diagonal blocks. Right? Now, the diagonal blocks mean we really only have one position we're dealing with, I equals J. This is where we store the self energies. So in each of these, we would put the self energy of choice S1 everywhere in this first block along the diagonal, because a self energy is associated with a specific choice. And everywhere else is zeros. And do the same thing for the self energies of the rotamer choices at position 2, and all the way down to the self energies at position N. These diagonal blocks are diagonal matrices that store the self energies. Now, depending on, now if we think about sort of how we do our loop, go back to our, let's actually put in our indices here. Our indices were from I equals 1 to N, I equals 1 to N. But the second term of the second sum was J equals I plus 1 to N. J equals I plus 1 to N. What does that mean in the context of this matrix? It means that all of the things below the diagonal, well, this is a case where I equals 2 and J equals 1. This, we had J is less than I. When J is less than I, there's no terms involving pairs where J is less than I. How do we represent this in the matrix? We put just zeros everywhere down here. So this is a upper triangular block matrix. All of the blocks below the diagonal are completely empty. The diagonal matrices are diagonal matrices. So it's actually also a strictly upper triangular matrix, as well as an upper triangular block matrix. And then we have the pieces above the diagonal. Okay? The blocks above the diagonal include all of the cases where J is greater than I. And this is where our pair energies come in. In each of these matrices, these are not diagonal matrices. These are full non-sparse matrices. that include all of the pair energies. This first matrix will involve all of the pair energies between choices at position 1 and choices at position 2. And again, this is a dense matrix. This block here would involve all of the pair energies between position position 1, choices at position 1, and choices at position n. And everywhere along this row, each block would have all of the pairwise interactions between choices at position 1 and choices at all other positions. Then the above the diagonal blocks at position 2 would fill in all the interactions, the pair interactions that position 2 makes with other choices at other positions, also a dense matrix, and so on. Right? And in this way, this matrix stores all the possible contributions to the total energy. Now, how do we convert from this matrix that stores all of the possible energy terms into an actual energy? We also need to add in a concept of our sequence vector, an encoding of what actual rotamer sequence combination we're working with. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to define another vector x. I'm going to make a distinction between this and the vector s. And this is going to be a vector that also is broken up. And I'm going to write this as a, actually, let me do this as a column vector. It might be easier. So define this as a column vector. And we are going to do the same kind of division that we had just done. Right? We're going to break this into blocks. I equals 1, I equals 2, to I equals n. And inside each of those blocks, we're going to make the same classification that we did for the previous case. We're going to set S1 equals 1, 2 to M1, S2 equals 1, 2, up to M2, Sn equals 1, 2, up to Mn. Same structure as we had before. And we are going to, actually, let me write this as S sub x. Oh, sorry, not S, x sub s. So I'm going to put in a subscript s here, right? And this is going to be, we can sort of think about the entry x I s I is a delta function in terms of S, choice S, I. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean that this is going to be 1 if Si is the position that we're at, and 0 otherwise. Actually, how should we do this? Yeah, okay, so maybe probably best just to sort of go through an example to kind of show this, right? So what do we mean by this? What we mean that, let's say, for example, we had our S vector had choice 3 at position 1, right? S1 equals 3, and had choice 2 at position 2, and had, let's say, choice M n minus 1, right? At the last position. Sn equals m n minus 1, one less than the largest. Well, what would this mean? It would mean that in the first block, we have a 1 at the third position and zeros everywhere else, because we had choice. The choice we made was the third option at position 1. In the second position, the choice we made was at position 2. So it has a 0, 1, a 1 at position 2, and a 0 everywhere else. The last position, the choice we made was 1 before the last. So this would have a 0 at the last position, a 1 at the second to last position, and zeros everywhere else. In each of these blocks, we have a single 1, everything else zeros. We have exactly 1, 1 in every block. What does this kind of structure going to do? Well, when we multiply the matrix H by this, it's going to this is going to have the effect of picking out a particular row or a particular column based on how we do that. And with this definition, we can then actually write that E of x s can be written as x s transpose h x s. Just the same XHX structure that we saw in the Coulombic energies. It's a standard pairwise energy expression. But here, these X's encode a particular set of choices of rotamers, and H encodes all of the possibilities instead of being something like a Green's function matrix as we had in the Coulombic case. Now, strictly speaking, this actually just gives us our sum of pair and self energies. So we really ought to add on this constant fixed energy, but if we ignore it, it doesn't change the outcome of anything. Okay. So now we've kind of gone through, we've explained how we can, why we can compute this set of all possible pairwise energies, how we can store it, and how we can now kind of represent this problem of a pre-computed energy matrix storing all of our energies. And what we want to do is we want to minimize over this set of possible x's of x, h, x to find our best possible set of rotamers. Now, how can we do this? Once again, there are a number of different possible algorithms that we can do to do this. The first of the ones that I want to introduce is an algorithm known as self-consistent mean field. What this approach is going to does is it takes a lesson from real world physics, from bulk physics, and the idea that in ensembles of structures, we describe their energies with the rules of statistical physics. And what do we do in that context? We describe some expectation of an energy, some average energy, as a sum over all possible states of the system. And we take a weighted average, the probability of being in that state multiplied by the energy of that state, where the energy of the state is, of course, given by the Boltzmann formula, e to the negative energy over kT divided by a partition function, where this partition function is just a sum over all states of precisely that same piece. And so what the self-consistent mean field approach does is says, well, what if we tackle this problem as if each position was independent and we were trying to find the lowest energy, lowest free energy state of the system. Remember that why do we get these probability distributions? These probability distributions, this particular set minimizes a free energy, right? An energy plus entropy. And so what if we take that same approach and we ask, what would the this problem look like if we asked about minimizing free energy in some kind of abstract sense? And the way this works is we're going to, first of all, relax one key assumption. We're going to relax the assumption that a single choice is made at each position. Now, this seems a little bit weird. How can you make more than one choice at one position? Well, this is where these probabilities come in, right? That what we're going to define PSI as the probability or frequency of choosing or observing S, rotamer S, at position I. All right. And we're going to assume that all of these positions are independent. At their kind of that is that their probabilities are multiplicative when we have to get the whole total probability. And this gives us the probability of some particular state is simply the product over all the possible states, the probability of each choice at a particular state. And this is exactly what we mean. This is the where the mean field piece comes in. We're going to assume that the probability of the particular microstate, that is a choice of a particular rotamer at every single position, can be written simply as a product of the probabilities of each individual piece, interacting with some average field of all of the other pieces. In this model, when we have this idea that we actually have a probability of having a particular choice at each state, the total energy becomes kind of a bit of a different beast. We actually have to describe this average energy. And we discussed how this would end up being this sum over all of the states. But with this mean field approximation, we can go further and we can break this down into exactly the same sort of sum over positions, self energies, and pair energies, but we need to modify it a little bit. And instead of just having a single energy associated with a single state or a single set of rotamer choices, we have an average energy, an ensemble energy that is based on the probability or frequency of rotamers at every possible state. So we have to add in an extra sum over all possible rotamers. We'll compare this to the sum of a single rotamer. We're now summing over all possible rotamers at one position, but still using the self energy. And then we add to that a sum from I equals 1 to n, a sum from j equals I plus 1 to n, and now again a sum over choices, and we actually need two of these, sum over sj equals 1, to mj. The probabilities are independent, so the probability of a pair is the product of the probabilities of those individual pieces. multiplied by the pair energy. And actually, let me, rather than use S here, let me use T. It'll just probably simplify things a little bit, especially since sometimes when we write, just when I write S's and, or sorry, I's and J's, they're not always totally resolvable. So making this TJ equals 1 to MJ. Probability of SI, probability of TJ, SI, TJ. This is exactly comparable again to the sum I equals 1 to N, J equals I plus 1 to N, E pair, SI, SJ term that we looked at before. Right? Now, these might look like they're a lot messier. Remember, though, that if you want to kind of get a sense for why these still might be quite similar terms, we should remember that the set of all choices at one particular position. So what are these P S sub i's? They describe the probability of choosing a particular rotamer at position I. What this requires is that the sum over SI, PSI has to equal 1 for all positions, right? Their probabilities, the sum of all possible choices at a particular position has to add up to 1. And so when we think about this, when we remember that the sum of the PS's has to equal 1, well, yes, we're taking up a sum out of self energies instead of just taking a single self energy, but the total set of weights adds up to 1, just like it did here. Right? Similarly, in this case, we're taking a double sum and then a double sum over all states, but these two individual sums over the possible probabilities also end up giving us 1. So the overall energy is actually quite comparable. If we think about what this structure is, this actually is exactly the same. This looks like a bigger, more complicated energy function, but this energy ends up simply being exactly the same as X transpose X H, but with X is a vector that includes the vector of probabilities at position 1, at position 2, up to position N, where each of these vectors of probabilities is the probability of, is the vector that contains these individual probabilities for each individual state. So instead of having a vector that a vector X that contains each block has a single 1 and all zeros. Each block has a set of probabilities that add to 1, but that may have many non-zero entries in them. So it still sits within exactly the same energy framework. The X that we discussed before with a single choice at each special case is a special case of this general probability description, but they are otherwise quite consistent. Now, this is a framework. It lets us write down the energies. How do we get these probabilities? And this is where the mean field part of self-consistent mean field came in, this description of the energies in terms of probabilistic ensemble-based description. We find the probabilities with a self-consistent method. What are self-consistent methods? Well, self-consistent methods are iterative approaches that use the same rule that we're trying to kind of find the answer for in order to successively update and get our answers. So what's the self-consistent algorithm to find PI? Right. Let's just outline this step by step. The first thing that we do is that we set an initial guess. The most straightforward and least likely to give us a bias for this choice is to set PSI is 1 over MI for all SI. What does this do? This means that we're choosing a uniform distribution. All rotamers have the same probability at every position to start. And how do we do this? Well, then what do we do? Our next step is going to update the probabilities, find new probabilities, using the function, the Boltzmann function that exactly we're looking for. And how do we do this? We want to update these PSI by computing the energy of rotamers SI in the mean field background of all other positions. What exactly do we mean by this? Well, we can do something like this. We define I'm going to call this PSI prime. Actually, let me just call, sure. To look exactly like what we started with, right? PS1, actually, let me use a different notation here, sorry. It's going to be too confusing while I'm with that choice. let's define x prime to be a vector that is exactly as we said, our vector P1, our vector P2, up to some point. So all of these are going to be exactly the same. Remember, our x vector that we discussed before was just this P1, P2, Pi, Pn. We're going to take a single position Pi, and we're going to replace this with the framework that we had before with a delta Si in this piece. A single one where we've made the choice and zeros everywhere else. Now, what are we really doing here? What this corresponds to, so in this X, every position is averaged, right? We're representing all possible rotamers at all possible positions weighted by their probabilities. What are we doing in this case? We have one position fixed. We've made a choice at one particular position, but all others are averaged. Right? Now, once we've done this, right, we've fixed one position and we've allowed all of the others to be remain averaged, we define an energy associated with that. And once again, we use exactly the same framework. Let me write this ESI, this energy of choice S at position I is simply this X prime SI, H X prime SI. This X vector where we leave everything as probabilities, but we fix one. And once we have this energy, we can define our update rule. Our update rule is that P SI is e to the negative ESI over KT divided by Q, where Q is sum over all possible SI. Actually, let me call this QI to be clear. E, so SI equals 1 to MI e to the negative SI over KT. So how would we actually, what are we doing here? We're using the Boltzmann distribution. Essentially, we're saying, we have some average background of structures, some weighted average probabilities of rotamers at every position. And we ask, if we made a choice and placed one rotamer at one position into this background, what would its energy be? And we do the same thing for each position. So we have to do something like for all I, for each SI, compute ESI. Once we have our energies, then we can compute QI, and then once again, for each SI, we can compute our PSI. So what are we doing here? We're walking through each position. And then at each position, we ask, if I had to make a choice and choose this particular amino acid given the average everywhere else, what would the energy be? And that's what this ESI is. Right? We do that at every position. Some of the choices will have a higher energy, some of them will have a lower energy. We then find new probabilities for that position, given using the Boltzmann distribution with the normalization only over those positions, because we're only making choices at one position. And then we can go over and we do the same thing at the second position and so on, right? And our third step of this algorithm, if it's even really considered to be a step, is to iterate, i.e., repeat step 2 until we reach some sort of convergence. That is, the probabilities aren't changing anymore. Now, what do we get out of this? Our answer is a set of probabilities. This set PSI. What do we do with these? Right? This isn't a design. This doesn't actually answer a design problem. How do we go from this what does a design require? A design requires a single amino acid choice at each position. Right? There really are two possibilities. Option 1, we simply take the sum of PSI for rotamers of the same amino acid at each position. And this will give us some P amino acid I, right? The probability of having a particular amino acid as our choice at each position. And then simply choose the largest at every position. This is kind of similar to consensus-based design. Consensus-based design is an idea that you can design protein sequences not using structure, but just using alignments of sequences. And if you take a family of proteins and you align their sequences and you look, what is the most common amino acid at each position, the consensus sequence, and you make that sequence, it actually turns out that those consensus sequences are usually quite stable. They generally fold into the same fold as the family does, as perhaps might be expected, but they also are often more stable than any of the other family members. Right? And there's an idea that sort of consensus forms the core structure, and then all of the other proteins have kind of sacrificed stability for function or something along those lines. Okay. This idea is simply saying we're going to take this approach, and whichever one seems to be the most common, we're going to take. The challenge with that is that sometimes most common might be kind of borderline. It also is possible that you get kind of weird choices. It is possible, for example, a potential error in naively using this approach anyway, might be that you might imagine there's two positions that are close to one another, position A and position B. And maybe when we look at these probabilities and we look at position A and we look at position B, maybe a salt bridge is very, very favored there. And so we might see something like at position A, we see aspartic acid 20% of the time. We see glutamic acid 19% of the time. We see lysine 19% of the time. And we see arginine 19% of the time. Right? And then we see other stuff the rest of the time. Realistically, these are all equal choices. Sorry, here I need to take a brief, something has just went a little bit weird with my screen. So I stopped the screen share. I'm going to try to go back to that. It was all just flickering on me, so I couldn't draw properly. Let's see what happens if we go back there. Let's keep those. Sorry. Share screen again. Go back to the whiteboard. Apologies for this. Go back here. There is, in fact, an ordering here, but realistically, these are all the same. But it might be that B has a kind of similar ordering. Maybe glutamine 20% of the time, aspartate also 20% of the time, and lysine and arginine both 19% of the time. Maybe glutamine and lysine can do a tiny bit of other stuff. Maybe they can do, there's a few things that they can make interactions with something that isn't a positive charge, but the positive charges really need to have that negative charge there. And so we get a little bit of a bias, right? Maybe only a 1% bias, maybe a 2% bias, or so on. If we were to go the consensus design, what really is happening here is that in all of the designs, we often have a negative and a plus, or a plus and a negative. And in about almost 40% of the time, we're getting this, either aspartate or glutamate. And in about 40% of the time, we're getting the other, positive, negative, negative, positive. But because there's other stuff that can also go on, maybe we have a slight preference for having glutamate there. So maybe there is 1% of the time we get a negative and a neutral, and 1% of the time we get a neutral and a negative, but we never get a positive and a neutral, that 0% or the other, right? This would be all we need to get this little bias to have a little bit more of the negative. If we do consensus-based design and we choose the best possibility, what do we end up choosing? We end up choosing aspartate at position A, glutamate at position B, and we end up with a negative right next to a negative, which is a very unfavorable situation. Now, this is a little bit of a contrived situation. If you actually look at all of the sequences, you should be able to notice that there actually are alternatives there and this structure is in place. So maybe this is a little bit of a contrived error, but it's something to at least consider as a potential problem. Right? A second option is to use temperature. Let's take a look. Remember, what is our update rule and what are we using? We're using e to the negative psi over kt over, so no, e si, right? Psi equals e to the negative si over qi. Temperature plays a role in here. When temperature is high, we expect, remember, these energies are sort of fixed, really, for a singular design problem, which means the differences matter less. At high temperature, we have a flatter probability distribution. What closer to uniform. And actually, in the limit of t goes to infinity, p goes to the uniform distribution. At low temperature, we have a very sharply peaked probability distribution. And in the limit of t goes to 0, this probability goes to the delta function, where we have a single choice at each position and no others. The single best energy choice is the only one we keep at each position. This gives us a strategy. Remember, in our design problem, what did we really want? We kind of want this delta function. We want to have a single best energy for each, or a single best choice for each position. This would give us exactly that. What are we starting with? We're starting with a uniform distribution. That's our best initial guess. And so looking at this, we kind of see that in some sense, what we're starting with is the infinite temperature case. And what we would like is the low temperature case. So perhaps we can take a page out of simulated annealing. And use of variable temperature. How would we do this? Well, we start with a high temperature and use a uniform distribution as initial guess. Apply the full self-consistent mean field method to give us a set of probabilities at this T1, this first temperature. Then we lower the temperature to some temperature T2. We use the probabilities from this initial run as our initial guess. And then apply the full SCMF method to get our probabilities at our second temperature. And we continue this until we get our final temperature probabilities at a low temperature. Unlike sort of simulated annealing in the context of molecular dynamics or in Monte Carlo, which tends to need a continuously varying temperature to give reasonable results, this method can work quite well, even with a relatively small number of temperatures and fairly large jumps between them. You don't need to have a continuously varying stream or very, very small temperature differentials. You can take reasonable jumps in temperature space to get to this answer. All right. This method, self-consistent mean field, has a number of really great advantages. One is that it is fast. This is not a method that takes a lot of calculations. Each evaluation, what do we need to do? We need to go through each of our positions. So we have to do an update of n positions, and we need to update each of the possibilities at each of these positions. And each of those updates involves an energy calculation, which is as we already said, n squared m squared in order to, oh, sorry, that's not, I am wrong about that. The actual, let me think about the energy calculation. Yes, actually, the energy calculation is still going to be, n squared m squared, so that's right. So we have basically an order n cubed, m cubed calculation. This might not seem fast, right? This sounds like a pretty expensive calculation to do, but we have to do it very few times. And because we have to do it very few times, this is entirely accessible at the scale of fast computers. So maybe, let's say this, relatively fast. Just as importantly, it's deterministic. Unlike genetic algorithms and Monte Carlo, which you never really know when you're done. They're based on random chance. They're based on stochastic changes. How do you know when you're really finished? You're never sure of your answer. This method, when you get an answer, you know what the answer is. Okay. There's one fairly strong disadvantage here. There's no guarantee that the solution is indeed the global minimum. The algorithm is structured. It is indeed set up that it should give you a well-defined best probability of minimum free energy in the context of this mean field approximation. And you may think that because of the Boltzmann weighting, that should be biased towards low energy states, but there isn't really any fundamental guarantee that this is the case. The best mean field solution may not be the best actual solution. But it does in fact work. And in protein design, that is really the best measure of success. There's actually a pair of papers that, well, there's multiple papers on this method. The method itself is described in a paper was described in a paper in the Journal of Molecular Biology. Volume 306 in 2001. This work was pioneered by Jeff Savin, who's at University of Pennsylvania. And there was a application, probably the most notable initial application anyway of this method, was a few years later in PNAS. Oops. This was in 2004. Sorry, missing a number there. It was not a 1,600-page paper. And what they actually did in the second of these papers, the Kono paper describes the method, the Slovak paper describes using this method to make a design and to then use it. They used this design to actually take a protein that's an ion channel. And ion channels are membrane proteins. They sit inside the cellular membrane, and they are notoriously hard to work with because they sit in the membrane. And it makes them hard to crystallize. It makes them hard to do NMR spectroscopy with and so on. And they said, can we take this and redesign it to be a soluble protein? And so they took a structure, I believe it was a fairly coarse, low resolution structure, and basically erased all of the sequence on the outside of it, as well as in the boundary and all this, and asked, can we redesign this protein to have the same fold, but be water soluble, by putting hydrophilic groups on the outside instead of the inside. They designed the sequence using this approach, and it worked. They were able to find a protein that they were able to structurally characterize. It was water soluble. It bound the same ion blocker molecules that bind the native ion channel, and all of these sorts of things. All right, so deterministic method that, although it might not be guaranteed to give us the global minimum, will give us an answer that is quite likely to be close to the global minimum, and for design that may be perfectly adequate. All right, so now that we've described the basic framework of how we describe energetically these systems with rotamer-based choices at each position, and we've gone through one example of an algorithm to solve this, the self-consistent mean field problem. In the next couple of videos, we're going to introduce a few new algorithms, dead-end elimination and A-star. These are my favorite algorithms, especially for protein design. I think they are incredibly elegant, incredibly powerful. These are methods that actually can give us guaranteed global minimum solutions in a deterministic way if we get an answer. And this is the caveat. These methods are in a class of algorithm that they're not guaranteed to give us an answer. But if they give us an answer, it's guaranteed to be the global minimum. And that's what we will be getting into next. Until then, take care and be well.